Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to really tackle the neurobiology of mood disorders. We're going to try and build a shortcut for you right through some incredibly dense source material.
It's a big topic. We're aiming to unpack the whole spectrum, from depression to mania, and look at the roles of some key players like norepinephrine and GABA.
And also this, frankly, pretty concerning idea of illness progression. So let's start at the very beginning. We often call these affective disorders, but a diagnosis isn't just about a change in mood, is it?
Not at all. A major depressive episode, for instance, requires, well, you have to meet the criteria for at least 5 symptoms.
Okay.
And surprisingly, only one of those actually needs to be the depressed mood itself.
Right, and it's similar on the other side of the coin. For a manic episode.
Exactly. It isn't just about feeling great or, being irritable. The person has to have at least 3 additional symptoms, or 4 if their mood is only irritable.
Things like racing thoughts, grandiosity, that kind of thing.
Yes, or a massively decreased need for sleep. These symptoms classically gave us these 2 very clean poles.
The depression down pole and the mania or hypomania up pole.
And that's where the traditional classification came from. Unipolar depression just means you only experience that down pole.
But bipolar disorder means you get both.
You get both. Bipolar 1 is defined by having at least 1 full manic episode. Bipolar 2 is a bit different.
Okay, how so?
For bipolar 2, you need at least 1 major depressive episode, but it's paired with at least 1 hypomanic episode. That's a lesser but still very significant upstate.
But the thinking on this has really changed, especially with this idea of mixed features.
Oh, absolutely. This is where it gets messy, in a way.
Because symptoms of both mania and depression are happening at the same time.
Exactly. And that forces us to move away from those neat, separate categories. It's much more of a continuous spectrum. You can have a patient who's depressed, but also agitated, irritable, with racing thoughts, all at once.
That overlap must create a huge challenge for diagnosis.
It's the single greatest challenge, I'd say. Trying to distinguish between unipolar depression and bipolar depression when the patient is sitting in front of you, currently depressed.
Because they look identical at that moment.
They look identical,
Yeah.
but the long-term treatment, the prognosis, it's all completely different. And misdiagnosis is so common and so dangerous.
How so?
Well, if you misdiagnose bipolar depression as unipolar, you raise the risk of cycling, of relapse, and you significantly increase the risk of suicide. It's critical to get it right.
So if a patient isn't giving you a clear history of hypomania, what are the red flags? What clues should you look for?
You're looking for patterns, really, a more cyclical, severe course. For example, an earlier onset of the illness, usually before age 25.
Okay, so age is a big one.
It is. Also, a history of multiple previous episodes. And you have to pay really close attention to irritability, any psychotic features or specific patterns of psychomotor agitation or retardation.
And the source material gave us those 2 really memorable clinical tips for this, the who's your daddy and where's your mama questions.
They sound simple, but they are so powerful. Who's your daddy is all about family history.
Right.
Having a first-degree relative with a bipolar spectrum disorder is the single biggest risk factor. It increases the patient's own risk by 8 to 10 times.
Wow, 8 to 10-fold.
So if the genes are there, you have to be suspicious. And where's your mama is our reminder to get collateral history, talk to an outside informant,
A spouse, a parent.
a close friend, anyone. Because patients often lack insight. They genuinely underreport or simply forget past hypomanic symptoms. It's not that they're hiding it.
That lack of insight is a powerful thing. Now, if the diagnosis is that tricky, what does it mean for the illness over the long term? This brings us to the progression hypothesis, which sounds pretty grim.
It is troubling. The hypothesis suggests that these disorders aren't static, they progress. We see evidence that recurrent unipolar depression can evolve into depression with mixed features.
And from there,
From there, it can progress into a full bipolar disorder, and then, all too often, into treatment resistance.
and the data on that is stark, isn't it? The presence of mixed features is tied to a 4-fold increase in suicide risk?
That's the one, a 4-fold increase. It just underscores how urgent early and complete treatment really is.
So if this disease is progressive, what's actually physically changing in the brain over time?
Okay, so this is where we need to pivot into the neurobiology that's underpinning all of this. We're going to focus on norepinephrine and GABA today, moving a bit beyond just serotonin and dopamine.
Let's start with norepinephrine, or NE. It's so important for attention, energy, vigilance, all things that go haywire in mood disorders.
Right. The whole process begins with an amino acid, tyrosine. There's an enzyme called tyrosine hydroxylase that converts tyrosine into something called DUPA.
And that enzyme is the key, isn't it? The rate-limiting step.
It's the gatekeeper. It acts like the main bottleneck, controlling how much NE can ultimately be produced. The process continues until dopamine is finally converted into NE.
And once it's made, it gets packaged up.
It gets packaged into storage vesicles inside the neuron using a transporter called VAP2.
So when that NE gets released out into the synapse, how does the brain stop the signal?
There are two main ways. First, you have the norepinephrine transporter, or NET. Think of it like a powerful little vacuum cleaner.
Sucking it back up.
Sucking it right back into the presynaptic neuron so it can be reused. Second, there are enzymes like MAO and COMT that just destroy it completely.
Okay. Now, when NE is out there, it binds to different receptors. We talk about alpha and beta receptors, but which one is the most critical for us to understand here?
That would have to be the presynaptic alpha-2 receptors. These are the famous autoreceptors.
Autoreceptors, so they regulate themselves.
Exactly. They're located right on the axon terminal in the cell body, and they act as the neuron's own brake. When NE binds to them, they sense there's enough NE in the synapse.
And they just shut off the release.
They shut it down. It's a classic negative feedback loop.
So a drug that blocks those alpha-2 autoreceptors, basically cutting the brake cable, would give you a big, immediate surge of norepinephrine.
Precisely. It's a way to ramp up NE transmission very quickly. Now let's switch gears completely and look at the brain's main braking system, GABA.
Gamma-aminobutyric acid, the principal inhibitory system.
Yes, it's essential for just dampening down and regulating all sorts of neuronal activity. The synthesis is actually quite simple.
Is it?
Yes. The excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate gets converted into GABA by one key enzyme, glutamic acid decarboxylase, GAD.
And stopping its action is similar to NE, with a pump and an enzyme.
Very similar. There's a GABA transporter, or GAT, that acts as the reuptake pump, and then an enzyme called GABA transaminase, or GABA-T, that destroys it.
But the real complexity comes in with the receptors, doesn't it?
Especially GABA.
Oh, absolutely. The GABA receptor is a ligand-gated ion channel, and it's an incredible piece of machinery. You have 5 subunits that cluster together to form a central channel.
And that channel lets chloride ions rush in. Right, which hyperpolarizes the neuron, making it much less likely to fire its own signal. But the specific subunits in that cluster completely change the receptor's function and where it's located.
And this is where we get the 2 major subtypes that are so important for treatment: BZ-sensitive and BZ-insensitive.
Let's start with the BZ-sensitive GABA receptors. BZ for benzodiazepine. These are typically found right in the synapse.
Okay.
And they mediate what we call phasic inhibition. Think of it like short, intense bursts of braking that only happen when there's a spike of GABA release.
And this is where benzodiazepine drugs come in. They bind to a totally separate spot on the receptor, not the GABA spot.
Right. It's an allosteric site. They act as positive allosteric modulators, or PAMs.
So they're not the key. They're more like the accelerator.
That's a great analogy. GABA is the key that starts the car. The BZ drug is the accelerator. If GABA is present, the BZ PAM makes the channel open more frequently, which powerfully enhances that braking effect. That's phasic inhibition.
Okay, so then what about the other type, the BZ-insensitive GABA receptors?
These are fascinating. They are located extrasynaptically outside the synapse, and they mediate tonic inhibition.
Tonic. So more of a constant state?
Exactly. If phasic is sudden, hard braking, tonic inhibition is like the constant background friction on the road. It sets the overall inhibitory tone or excitability of the neuron.
And what's so critical about this for mood disorders?
What's critical is that these extrasynaptic sites bind to naturally occurring things called neuroactive steroids.
And why is everyone so interested in neuroactive steroids right now?
Because unlike traditional benzos, which mainly hit anxiety and insomnia, these natural compounds have shown real antidepressant properties. The theory is that some types of depression might involve a failure of this normal background tonic inhibition.
So a drug targeting those specific sites could restore that balance, a totally new antidepressant mechanism.
That's the hope. It really helps explain why the old monoamine hypothesis is so incomplete.
Right. We've known for decades that even though antidepressants boost monoamines right away, it takes weeks for people to feel better.
It's just too simplistic. That delay in improvement tells you the real therapeutic action is happening downstream, and that's what led to the neuroplasticity and neuroprogression hypotheses.
Okay, so the delayed benefits actually line up with other slower changes in the brain.
They line up perfectly with the delayed downregulation of those monoamine receptors and, crucially, the slow synthesis of growth factors like BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor,
Well,
which is like fertilizer for the brain, right?
It's exactly like fertilizer for brain cells. It's essential for keeping synapses healthy, for promoting neuroplasticity. The neuroprogression model suggests that chronic stress and inflammation cause a loss of BDNF.
Yeah, when that happens.
When that happens, you see a physical loss of synapses, you see dendrites shrink back, and eventually you can even see neuron death or apoptosis.
And this is why you can actually see a structural damage in the brain with recurring depression, like a smaller hippocampus.
Yes, that's a critical point. The progression isn't just about symptoms getting worse. It means that each episode could be physically eroding the brain's hardware for regulating mood and memory. It's a terrifying thought.
And it connects to these other factors, like HPA axis dysregulation.
It does. The HPA axis is the body's central stress thermostat. Chronic stress makes it hyperactive, flooding the body with stress hormones like glucocorticoids.
And the hippocampus is supposed to put the brakes on that HPA axis. So if the hippocampus is shrinking from stress,
It can't do its job. The brake is lost, and you get a vicious cycle of chronic stress activation.
and we also see the impact of neuroinflammation.
Right. Chronic stress, obesity, other illnesses can activate the brain's immune cells, the microglia. They start releasing pro-inflammatory molecules that cause synaptic damage.
It's a cascade of damaging events. And finally, there's the circadian rhythm link.
Yes, depression is often described as a circadian illness. You see a phase delay in the sleep-wake cycle. Patients' body temperature rhythms flatten out, the crucial nighttime spike of melatonin is blunted, everything is desynchronized.
Which is why treatments like bright light therapy can be so effective. It's about resetting that internal clock.
Exactly.
So if we take all this incredibly complex biology, how does it change what a practitioner actually does at the bedside?
It leads to what we call symptom-based treatment selection. The idea is to stop looking at the diagnosis as one big blob.
You deconstruct it.
You deconstruct it into its component symptoms. Then you try to match each symptom to a brain circuit or node that's probably malfunctioning, and then you pick a drug that targets that specific node.
And we can group those symptoms into two main clusters, right? Reduced positive affect.
Which is things like loss of pleasure, no energy, no confidence. That's mainly driven by dopamine and norepinephrine dysfunction.
And the other cluster is increased negative affect.
That's your guilt, anxiety, hostility, irritability. And those symptoms are predominantly driven by serotonin dysfunction, although NE is involved there too.
So that tells you whether you should start with a drug that boosts serotonin or one that boosts dopamine and NE.
Or both. And this approach is so helpful when you're dealing with those stubborn residual symptoms.
Okay, so give us an example. A patient's mood is stable, but they still have terrible fatigue and can't concentrate.
Okay, so those symptoms are linked to circuits in the prefrontal cortex and the striatum. The neurotransmitters that run those circuits are NE and DA. So your next move has to be a mechanism that boosts one or both of those.
But if their residual symptom was insomnia,
Totally different circuit, different mechanism. Insomnia is linked to the hypothalamus. So you'd need to target GABA or maybe block certain serotonin and histamine receptors. It's a completely different strategy.
it's a much more tailored, precise approach. You're building a portfolio of mechanisms to hit every last symptom and get to full remission.
That's the goal. So, just to recap, we've really gone across the entire mood disorder spectrum. We've looked at the critical roles of N and GABA and seen how theories have evolved from simple monoamines to this idea of neuroprogression.
And I think the big takeaway for you, the listener, has to be the long-term impact of this. Cognitive symptoms, trouble with memory, concentration, they often last longer than the mood symptoms.
And they get worse with the number of episodes a person has. It's direct evidence of that cumulative damage taking place over time.
Which highlights just how urgent, aggressive, early, and complete treatment really is. The best chance to stop that progression, and maybe even reverse some of that damage, is to get to sustained remission as early as you possibly can.
It is, and it's exactly why there's so much excitement about new agents that target glutamate and GABA systems. In research models, they seem to be able to restore synapses very quickly.
A truly fascinating area for the future. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.